Edward Thompson never imagined that, at 68, the greatest battle of his life would come not from illness or old age, but from within his own family. A retired professor of literature, Edward had spent decades shaping young minds before, finally settling into a quieter life in Portland, Oregon, after his beloved wife Margaret passed away 5 years earlier. He poured his soul into the one place that still made him feel alive, a small neighborhood bookstore. The creak of the wooden floors, the smell of worn paperbacks, and the conversations with loyal customers were his refuge. But while Edward lived modestly, his son Daniel, a 43-year-old corporate manager with a taste for luxury, was living far beyond his means. Daniel's wife, Jessica, enjoyed the finer things: designer handbags, country club dinners, and vacations that drained their bank accounts. And caught in the middle was 16-year-old Emily, Edward's granddaughter, who adored her grandfather but felt trapped between two worlds: the warmth of his bookshop and the cold demands of her parents' lifestyle. What Edward didn't know was that Daniel's charm and success were a little more than a mask, and that mask was beginning to crack. Soon, father and son would clash in a way that no one at that family table could have predicted, setting in motion a story of betrayal, survival, and the fight to hold on to one's dignity. Edward still remembers the knock on his front door that cold November morning. It wasn't the gentle knock of a neighbor, nor the cheerful ring of a delivery man. It was sharp, impatient, two quick raps that echoed through the quiet of his little home. When he opened the door, there stood his son, Daniel. Tailored suit, expensive watch, hair perfectly styled, as if he had stepped right out of a boardroom. "Dad, why does it always take you so long to answer?" Daniel brushed past him without waiting, his briefcase swinging against his leg. Edward tried to smile, tried to bridge the space between them with warmth. But Daniel's half-hearted pat on the back felt more like an obligation than affection. In the living room, Daniel spread out a set of papers across the coffee table. Legal documents, stamped and signed, filled with language only lawyers love to use. "Dad," he began, voice firm, almost rehearsed, "you're living alone in this big house. The bookstore takes too much out of you. I want to make things easier. All you need to do is sign these forms." Edward sat down slowly, his fingers brushing the edge of the paper. He had spent a lifetime teaching students how to read between the lines of Shakespeare, Hemingway, and Faulkner. It didn't take him long to see through the words in front of him. The so-called power of attorney wasn't protection, it was surrender. Signing meant the house, the bookstore, and everything he had built would no longer be his. He looked up at his son. "Daniel, this doesn't just give you permission to help. It hands you everything." For just a second, Edward saw a flicker cross his son's face, a tightening of the jaw, a twitch at the corner of his mouth. Then Daniel leaned back, arms crossed. "It's just a safeguard, Dad. If something happens to you, everything will be protected." "Protected from what?" Edward asked quietly. "From whom?" Daniel's sigh filled the room. "From taxes. It's from red tape. It's from unnecessary hassle. Trust me, it's the smart thing to do." Edward placed the pen down on the table. His voice was calm but steady. "No, son, I won't sign this." The air shifted. Daniel rose to his feet, pacing the room like a man whose deal had just collapsed. "You've always been stubborn," he snapped. "You think you're doing the right thing, but you're not. You're making everything harder." Edward wanted to remind him of sacrifices long forgotten. Nights he had worked 2 jobs just to put Daniel through school. Mornings when Margaret had gone without, so that their son could have more. But instead, he simply said, "If you want to help me, come by more often. Bring Emily. That's what I need." For a brief moment, Daniel's expression softened. But the wall came back quickly. He swept the documents into his briefcase, the snap of the lock sounding final. "Think about it, Dad. I'll give you time. You'll see him right." With that, he left, leaving Edward alone in the silence of his own living room. Papers may have been gone, but the unease lingered. Something deeper was brewing beneath Daniel's polished exterior, something darker than simple impatience. Edward walked into the bookstore that afternoon with his heart heavy. The shelves, lined with the words of great minds, seemed to whisper back at him. He thought of Margaret, her laughter, her steady faith in him. Her words the night before she passed, "Take care of yourself, Ed. Don't let anyone count your blessings for you." That evening, Edward closed the shop earlier than usual. Sat by the window with a cup of tea, staring out at the rain-soaked streets of Portland. The fear wasn't about losing a house, or even the store. It was about losing the one thing he had always believed would last forever, his son's respect. But respect had already slipped away. And soon, Edward would discover that Daniel's request was never about helping. It was about survival. And Daniel's survival came at the cost of his father's freedom. A week passed before Edward heard from Daniel again. He expected silence, maybe even a cold distance after their argument over the papers. But instead, one Thursday evening, his phone buzzed. The caller ID read simply, "Daniel, Dad." His son's voice was unusually warm. It's almost rehearsed. "Jessica's birthday is this Sunday. We're hosting a little dinner at the house. We'd love for you to come." For a moment, Edward didn't know what to say. He hadn't been invited to one of their gatherings in over a year. Birthdays, anniversaries, holidays all celebrated. Without him, now suddenly an invitation. He felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the rift between them was beginning to heal. He agreed quickly, almost too quickly, and after hanging up, found himself standing in the quiet of his living room, smiling for the first time in weeks. He thought of Emily's sweet 16, bright-eyed, always tugging at his sleeve in the bookstore when she was younger, begging to read the classics. Seeing her again would be worth any tension the evening might bring. That Sunday, Edward dressed, carefully, a pressed shirt, the old navy blazer Margaret had once loved on him. He tucked a gift under his arm, a first-edition copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, something he knew Jessica would likely never read but might at least admire on a shelf. It wasn't the gift that mattered, it was the gesture, a way to remind them. He was still family, still trying. The house was grander than he remembered. Perched high in an exclusive Portland suburb with a driveway full of expensive cars. Edward couldn't help but wonder how Daniel and Jessica could possibly afford it. The mortgage alone had to be crushing. But he shook the thought away and rang the bell. Jessica opened the door, her blonde hair perfect, her smile practiced. "Edward! What a surprise!" "Come in." He stepped into the foyer, polished marble under his feet. Chandeliers casting light across walls hung with modern art. The place felt more like a showroom than a home, out back. The patio was set with long tables dressed in white cloth, wine glasses catching the afternoon sun. Guests mingled, faces Edward didn't recognize. Colleagues of Daniel, friends of Jessica. He felt out of place until he spotted Emily sitting alone at the corner of the yard, her eyes glued to her phone. "Grandpa." She leapt up the second she saw him, throwing her arms around his shoulders. That embrace alone was worth the entire trip. "I didn't know you were coming," she whispered, her voice filled with genuine excitement. "Your father invited me," Edward said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I wouldn't have missed it." But as he held his granddaughter close, he noticed Daniel and Jessica across the patio, watching the two of them with tight smiles. Something about their expressions unsettled him. Dinner began. And Edward was seated at the far end of the table, away from Daniel's closest friends. He listened quietly as Jessica basked in compliments, the center of attention in her designer dress. Edward offered his gift, and she accepted it with a polite nod, setting it aside without opening it, as dessert was served. Daniel rose from his seat, tapping his glass with a spoon. "Everyone," he said, smiling proudly, "thank you for joining us to celebrate Jessica's birthday. But tonight isn't just about her. It's also about my father." Edward froze. Conversations hushed. Daniel continued, his voice carrying. "Across the patio, after much thought, my dad has finally decided to retire fully. He's entrusted me with the management of his house and his bookstore. From now on, he can finally rest the way he deserves." Applause erupted. Guests raised their glasses. Jessica clapped with satisfaction, but Edward's chest tightened. He hadn't signed a thing. He hadn't agreed to anything. His hand trembled as he set his fork down. He stood slowly, the chatter dimming as all eyes turned toward him. "That is not true," he said firmly, his voice steadier than he expected. "I have not given anyone control of my life. My home, my Storth, they remain mine, and they will remain mine until the day I decide otherwise." The table fell silent. Emily's eyes widened, confusion painted across her face. Daniel's smile cracked. "Dad," he said through clenched teeth, "this isn't the time, no." "Daniel," Edward interrupted, "it's exactly the time, 'cause I won't stand by while you parade a lie in front of your friends. Not about me, not about Margaret's memory, certainly not about Emily's future." Gasps whispered around. The table, Jessica's cheeks flushed red. Daniel's fists tightened at his sides. And that was the moment Edward realized. This dinner had never been about family. It had been a stage, a trap, set for him to sign away his life in front of witnesses. Only now, the curtain had been pulled back for everyone to see. The silence. After Edward's words hung thick in the evening air, guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, glancing from father to son, as if they'd stumbled into a play where the script had suddenly gone off track. Jessica's painted smile had hardened into something sharp, and Daniel's jaw flexed as though he were holding back a storm. Edward reached for his napkin, tending to leave the table with dignity. "I think I've overstayed my welcome," he said quietly, his voice carrying further than he expected. He pushed his chair back and began walking toward the house. That was when Daniel's hand clamped down on his arm. "Sit back down," Daniel hissed. The mask of charm gone now, replaced by raw fury. Edward turned, his eyes meeting the sun. He had once carried on his shoulders through county fairs, the boy who had fallen asleep to bedtime stories in this very voice. "Daniel, let go of me." But instead of loosening, Daniel's grip tightened. His voice rose, sharp enough to make the silverware rattle. "You're embarrassing me in front of everyone?" The crowd was frozen, caught between politeness and shock. Edward tried to pull away, but age had softened his strength. And then it happened. A sudden flash of motion, Daniel's fist driving forward, connecting with his father's face. The blow sent Edward stumbling backward, his hand flying to his cheek as the taste of iron filled his mouth. Gasps echoed around the patio. A whine. Glass shattered somewhere near the table. And above it all came a cry that pierced through the chaos in Millie's voice. "Dad, what have you done?" She rushed forward, dropping her phone, her young arms catching her grandfather as he sagged against her shoulder. "Grandpa, are you okay?" she whispered, her voice shaking, tears already streaming down her face. Edward steadied himself, pushing back the dizziness. He cupped his granddaughter's face gently with a trembling hand. "I'm all right, sweetheart, I promise." But he wasn't all right, not inside. The sting on his skin was nothing compared to the ache in his chest, the realization that his own son had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Jessica hurried to Daniel's side, not to scold him, but to hold him back from striking again. Her voice was low, calculated. "Stop. There are witnesses." The guests were no longer clapping or smiling. They were gathering their coats, exchanging uneasy glances, some slipping out quietly as though desperate to escape the ugliness of what they had just seen. Edward straightened, wiping the blood from his lip with his sleeve. He turned to face his son, the man who now stood breathing hard, fists still clenched. "I never thought I'd see the day," Edward said, his voice broken but steady. "Your mother would be ashamed." For a moment, Daniel's eyes flickered. With something guilt, perhaps, but it vanished as quickly as it came, swallowed by anger. He turned away, refusing to meet his father's gaze. "Grandpa, don't leave alone," Emily pleaded, clutching his arm. But Jessica stepped in swiftly. "Emily, stay here. Your grandfather needs to go. He's caused enough drama for one night." Edward wanted to argue, to take his granddaughter by the hand and walk out together. But he knew that if he fought Jessica now, they'd use Emily as a pawn. He bent down, kissed Emily's forehead, and whispered, "I'll be fine. Don't worry about me." His steps toward the gate felt heavier than any weight he'd carried. In his life, he could feel every eye on his back, the humiliation of being ushered out of a celebration where he had been nothing more than a prop in Daniel's performance. When the door closed behind him, the crisp night air hit his lungs like ice. Edward stood for a long moment in the driveway, staring at the glow of the house he used to visit freely, the home where laughter once rang out during Christmas dinners. Now it was a fortress of deceit, guarded by his own blood. As he drove back toward his modest bookstore, Edward's thoughts spiraled. His cheek throbbed with every beat of his heart. But the deeper wound was knowing that the boy he had raised with love and sacrifice had become a man capable of striking him down. That night, alone in his small kitchen, Edward replayed the scene over and over. The gasps of the guests, Jessica's cold calculation, Daniel's rage, and Emily's tears, her voice trembling as she tried to protect him. It was in that moment he realized Emily was the only ally he had left in that house, and it terrified him to think what might happen to her, trapped under the roof of parents who had already proven just how far they were willing to go. 3 days passed after the disastrous birthday dinner, and Edward hadn't set foot outside his home. The bruise on his cheek was fading from deep purple to a sickly yellow, but the ache inside his chest was still raw. He busied himself with the bookstore, dusting shelves and rearranging displays no one had asked for. It was easier than replaying, the sound of his son's fists connecting with his face. Easier than remembering the look in Emily's eyes when she saw it happen. That Wednesday afternoon, as he was brewing a cup of coffee, a soft knock rattled the door. Not the sharp, demanding pound of Daniel, but something gentler, hesitant. Edward's heart quickened. He peeked through the small window and froze. Standing on the porch was Emily, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her hair messy from the Oregon wind. He opened the door at once. "Emily, what on earth?" She rushed into his arms, nearly dropping her bag. "Grandpa, I had to see you. I couldn't stop thinking about what happened." Her voice cracked, and he pulled her close, pressing his chin against her hair. "Sweetheart, you shouldn't be here alone. Do your parents know where you are?" She shook her head quickly. "They think I'm at a friend's house studying for a history test. Please don't tell them. They'd never let me come if they knew." Edward guided her inside, shutting the door with trembling hands. He poured her a glass of orange juice, the same way he used to when she was a little girl perched at his kitchen table, swinging her legs. But this time, she wasn't a carefree child. Her face was pale, her hands fidgeting. "What your dad did to you. It was horrible," she whispered, her eyes filling again. "I've never seen him like that before. He's angry all the time now. And Mom, she says terrible things about you when she thinks I can't hear. She calls you stubborn, selfish. Says you could fix everything, but you won't." Edward's brow furrowed. "Fix what?" Emily leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're in trouble, Grandpa. Real trouble. I heard them fighting. They've missed mortgage payments. Mom's credit cards keep getting declined. They already sold some of her jewelry, and they almost couldn't pay my tuition for next semester." Edward sat back, stunned. Suddenly, the puzzle pieces aligned, the rushed legal papers, the staged announcement at the party, the desperation in Daniel's eyes. It wasn't about helping him. It was about saving themselves from a collapse they had built with their own greed. "My God," Edward muttered. "So that's why he's so determined to take the house, the bookstore?" Emily nodded, her lip trembling. "He thinks if you sign it all over, the bank won't take everything. But Grandpa..." She reached for his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "I don't want you to do that. It's not right." He squeezed her fingers, his throat tightening. "I won't, Emily. This house, this bookstore, they're more than property. They're the life your grandmother and I built. I won't let them vanish because your parents can't live within their means." She exhaled a shaky breath of relief, but then her eyes darted toward the door. "I'm scared of what they'll do if you don't. Dad's not himself anymore. And Mom, she's always whispering about ways to get rid of you legally." Her words chilled him more than the November wind. For the first time, Edward felt the real danger pressing in, not just the threat of signatures on a page, but the possibility that his own son would try to strip him of his freedom. He pulled Emily into another hug, his voice low, steady. "Listen. To me, sweetheart, whatever happens, I won't let anyone hurt you. You're the only light I've got left in this family. We'll get through this together. The doorbell rang suddenly, sharp and insistent, making them both jump. Edward's stomach dropped. Through the glass, he saw the unmistakable silhouettes. Daniel, Jessica, and a man in a dark suit with a leather briefcase. Emily clutched his arm. "Don't open it," she whispered urgently. But Edward already knew this confrontation couldn't be avoided forever. His son wasn't just after property anymore. He was after control. And Edward had a sinking feeling that the fight was about to escalate in ways neither he nor Emily could yet imagine. The doorbell kept ringing, sharp and relentless, as if whoever was outside intended to break it. Edward steadied himself before opening. Emily tugged at his sleeve, her voice low and urgent. "Grandpa, please, don't let them in." But Edward knew hiding would only feed their story, that he was unstable, paranoid, incapable of facing reality. He drew in a deep breath, then opened the door. There stood Daniel, his expression polished into false concern. Jessica at his side with her arms folded tight, and a man Edward had never seen before. The stranger was dressed in a dark suit, briefcase in hand. His smile, professional but cold. "Dad," Daniel said, voice measured. "This is Mr. Collins. He's here to help us discuss some important matters about your health." Edward's eyes narrowed. "My health." Jessica stepped forward, her tone sweet but dripping with condescension. "Edward, you've been under a lot of stress. After what happened at the party, well, it raised some red flags." Emily, unable to hold back, blurted out, "You mean, after Dad hit him in front of everyone?" Daniel's face darkened. "Emily, not now." He tried to wave her off, but Edward placed a protective hand on her shoulder. Mr. Collins adjusted his glasses, pulling out a document from his case. "Mr. Thompson, your son and daughter-in-law are concerned. They've noticed signs of forgetfulness, mood swings, poor judgment. These can be indicators of early dementia. Court has issued an order for an evaluation. It's for your safety." I felt heat rising in his chest. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity, but anger steadied his voice instead. "Dementia? One run a bookstore 6 days a week? I pay my bills on time. Read more books in a month than most people read in a year. Does that sound like a man losing his mind?" Jessica crossed her arms, feigning patience. "Edward, denial is part of the illness. We're only trying to help." Emily couldn't stay silent. "That's not true. You just want the house. You want the bookstore." Jessica turned on her, her mask slipping for a moment. "Young lady, you're out of line." Edward stepped forward, his voice firm. "Don't you dare speak to her that way. She's the only one in this family still telling the truth." For a flicker of a second, Daniel's eyes betrayed something panic. Maybe even shame, but it vanished under a hardened glare. He pressed the papers into his father's hands. "This evaluation is mandatory, Dad, tomorrow morning." "Really as sharp as you claim? It'll prove it, then we can put this all behind us." Edward scanned the paper. His hands trembled, not from confusion, but from fury. The court order looked official, signed and sealed. If he refused, it would only make him appear unstable. They had cornered him. Emily whispered fiercely, "Grandpa, don't go. It's a trap." He bent close to her ear. "I know, sweetheart, but if I resist, they'll win even faster. I have to face this." Then louder, he said, "Fine. I'll attend your evaluation. But know this, I'll bring my own attorney. You won't railroad me into anything." Daniel smirked, as if he had expected resistance but already believed himself victorious. "Tomorrow, 10 a.m. We'll pick you up," Jessica added, her smile thin as glass. "We'll make sure you're comfortable. That's what family is." 4. Edward closed the door after them, the click of the lock echoing through the house. He leaned heavily against the frame, his body shaking not from weakness but from the weight of betrayal. Emily clung to his arm. "Grandpa, what are you going to do?" He brushed her hair back, his voice soft but steady. "I'm going to fight. But not alone." That night, Edward dialed the number he hadn't used in years. Thomas Reed, his old friend, and now a respected attorney. When Thomas picked up, Edward didn't waste time. "It's happening, Tom. They're trying to declare me incompetent." Line went quiet, then Thomas's steady voice replied, "I'll be there in the morning. They won't take you without a fight." Edward hung up, relief washing over him for the first time in weeks. He still felt the sting of his son's betrayal, but now he knew he wasn't entirely alone. And in the eyes of his granddaughter, he saw something even stronger than fear. Faith that he still had enough strength left to stand his ground. The morning of the evaluation came with a cold drizzle, the kind of Portland rain that seeps into your bones. Edward was already dressed when the knock came to heavy raps on the door, followed by the ring of the bell. But this time when he opened it, he wasn't alone. Thomas Reed stood beside him. Silver-haired, tall, his presence filling the doorway. With quiet authority, "I'll handle the talking," he whispered, his hand resting briefly on Edward's shoulder. On the porch were Daniel, Jessica, and Mr. Collins again, each wearing carefully arranged expressions. Daniel looked surprised to see Thomas. "What's this?" he demanded. Edward's voice was calm. "My attorney. From now on, you don't speak to me without him present." The color drained from Jessica's face, though she quickly forced a smile, "Of course, Edward. Whatever makes you comfortable," he sighed. At the kitchen table, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Collins slid the paperwork across to Thomas, explaining the routine evaluation. Thomas skimmed the pages, his brow furrowing deeper with each line. Finally, he set them down with deliberate care. "This order," Thomas said evenly, "requires an evaluation, yes. But it does not grant guardianship, does not transfer assets. It does not strip my client of his rights. Any attempt to interpret it otherwise is a violation of the law." Daniel's jaw tightened. "We're just trying to protect him." "From what?" Thomas shot back. "From living independently? From running a bookstore he's managed successfully for years? Or from your own financial mistakes?" The room went silent. Jessica shifted uncomfortably, her nails tapping against her coffee cup. Daniel leaned forward, voice low, almost growling. "Dad, you don't understand. This is for everyone's good." Edward finally spoke, his voice carrying a quiet weight that silenced even his son. "If you truly wanted what's best for me, Daniel, you would have brought Emily over to see me. You would have spent time here, not schemed behind my back. You wouldn't have humiliated me in front of strangers." For the first time, Edward saw something flicker in his son's eyes. Not guilt, but fear. Fear that the mask was slipping, that the carefully built image of a dutiful son was cracking in front of a witness who knew the law. Collins cleared his throat. "Regardless, Mr. Thompson must appear at the clinic this afternoon for his evaluation. If he refuses, the court will interpret it as known compliance." Thomas folded his arms. "He'll go. I'll be by his side. And afterward, we'll be petitioning for an independent review of this entire process." He turned to Edward. "Don't worry, you're not alone anymore." Edward felt a lump in his throat, the kind that comes when someone finally steps in to carry part of the burden you've been shouldering alone. He nodded, grateful. When Daniel and Jessica left, the storm brewing in their eyes was more dangerous than any words they spoke. As the door clicked shut, Thomas sighed. "They won't give up, Ed. They're too desperate. You need to be ready for them to push harder." Edward walked to the window, watching his son's car disappear down the street. "I've lived through poverty, through losing Margaret, through years of raising a boy on my own. I thought those were my battles. But this feels different. This feels like war." Thomas placed a hand on the windowsill. "Then we fight. Smart. We gather evidence. We stay calm. Above all, we don't let them trap you into looking unstable. That's their only weapon." That evening after Thomas left, Edward sat in his bookstore with the lamps glowing softly around him. Customers had come and gone, but he hadn't noticed a single face. His mind was fixed on the storm ahead. He thought of Emily, the way she had clung to him, whispering warnings her parents would never forgive her for. She was still under their roof, still at their mercy. That fear gnawed at him even more than the threat to his own freedom, and as he closed up shop, he whispered into the empty room, almost as if speaking to Margaret's memory, "I won't let them win. Not this way. Not at the cost of everything we built." The rain had turned to sleet the morning the officers came. Edward had been sipping his coffee, trying to steady his nerves for the evaluation. When the knock came, not polite, not patient, but the pounding of authority. Two uniformed deputies stood on his porch, flanked by Daniel, Jessica, and a man Edward didn't recognize, Mr. Thompson. One officer said, "We have a court order to transport you to Greenfield Manor for further evaluation and care."
Edward's
stomach dropped. Care? That wasn't the agreement? I was supposed to attend an evaluation with my attorney. Thomas arrived minutes later, breathless from rushing through the storm. He argued fiercely, waving papers of his own, demanding the deputies verify the order. But the judge's signature was there, stamped and sealed. The officers shook their heads. "Our hands are tied, sir. He has to come with us," Edward packed. A small bag, just clothes, his medications, and a framed photograph of Margaret. As he climbed into the back of the transport van, Daniel leaned down with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Don't worry, Dad, you'll be well taken care of." The drive was quiet, except for the thrum of the engine and Edward's heart pounding in his ears. Greenfield Manor appeared at the end of a long, tree-lined road. From the outside, it looked almost inviting, an elegant facility with trimmed hedges, wide windows, and a sign boasting exceptional senior care. Inside, he felt the chill. The staff greeted him with smiles that seemed practiced, too polished. His belongings were catalogued, his phone taken, his wrists tagged with a plastic bracelet. It felt less like being admitted for care and more like being processed. They led him to a small room, clean. Yes, but sterile. White walls, a single bed, a dresser bolted to the floor. No lock on the inside of the door. It was, Edward realized, a place designed not for living, but for containment. Later that evening, he was escorted to the dining hall. That's where he met the others. At one table sat Mrs. Carter, a retired school teacher with soft eyes but a voice. Dulled by medication, she spoke slowly, each word a struggle, as if her mind was trapped behind a wall of fog. Next to her was Mr. Wallace, once a respected judge. His handshake was firm, his gaze still sharp, though he whispered cautiously. "Be careful what you say. They watch everything here," Edward frowned. "This is supposed to be a care facility." Wallace leaned closer, his tone grim. "Care isn't what they sell. It's control. Families pay to keep us locked up, and the staff keeps us quiet with pills." Before Edward could reply, a young orderly named Michael slipped him a glass of water. As their eyes met, Michael's expression carried something unusual pity. Later, when no one was watching, the young man leaned in and whispered, "Keep your head clear. Don't swallow everything they give you." Then he moved on, as if nothing had been said. That night, as Edward lay in his narrow bed, Margaret's picture clutched to his chest. He thought about the faces in the dining hall, the way some residents stared blankly into their plates, sedated beyond recognition. He thought about Daniel, about Jessica, about how easily they had signed him away to this place. And he thought of Emily's suite, Emily probably being told lies about where her grandfather had gone. A nurse entered with a small paper cup. "Your evening medication, Mr. Thompson?" Edward stared at the 2 pills inside. He remembered Michael's warning. With a calm smile, he lifted the cup, pretended to place the pills on his tongue, then raised the water to his lips. He swallowed. Hard, forcing the sound of a gulp, the nurse nodded, satisfied. "Good. Rest well." When she left, Edward spat the pills discreetly into a tissue and tucked it under his pillow. His heart raced. Already, he could see the plan. Medicate him, weaken him, and let Daniel and Jessica tighten their grip on everything he owned. As he lay in the dark, the truth pressed and heavy. This wasn't just about a house or a bookstore anymore. It was about his very freedom, his identity, his dignity. And if he didn't find a way to fight back, he would end his days here, just another forgotten name behind locked doors. The second night at Greenfield Manor was harder than the first. Edward lay awake long after lights out, listening to the faint hum of the ventilation system, the muffled footsteps of nurses making their rounds, and the occasional groan of another resident down the hall. It wasn't the noises that kept him up. It was the silence inside his own mind, the realization that if he didn't act, he could slowly fade away here, just like the others. At breakfast the next morning, he noticed Mrs. Carter again. Her hands shook as she lifted her spoon, her eyes clouded but still searching. When she caught Edward watching, she gave a faint smile. "New ones always look like deer caught in headlights," she whispered. Her voice was weak but honest. "Let them break you." Sitting across from her, Mr. Wallace leaned forward, lowering his voice. "They'll try. Pills, therapy sessions designed to make you doubt yourself. They'll call it treatment. But it's control, plain and simple." Edward nodded slowly, grateful for their candor. Why would families allow this? A bitter chuckle. Allow it. They pay for it. Most of us here aren't patients, we're investments. It's easier to lock us up than deal with us. And once they have our assets, we're no longer people. We're accounts. The words hit Edward harder than the punch from his son. He thought of his bookstore, his home filled with Margaret's memories, the sacrifices he had made so Daniel could have a future. And now that same son had traded his dignity for debt relief. Later that day, as Edward sat in the courtyard pretending to read, the young aide Michael slipped onto the bench beside him. His voice was low, his eyes darting to the security cameras mounted on the wall. "You didn't take last night's meds, did you?" Edward stiffened but didn't answer. Michael nodded slightly. "Good. Keep it that way. They can't make you sign anything or answer questions clearly if your head stays sharp." He reached into his pocket and pressed something small into Edward's palm. It was a folded note. "Read it when you're alone." Then he stood up and walked off as if nothing had happened. Back in his room, Edward opened the note. There are files, proof of what they're doing. Fake medical reports. Payoffs. Carter and Wallace can help you find them. Hide anything you get. Trust no one else. His heart raced. Finally, a thread of hope. He tucked the note inside the frame of Margaret's photo, the one object he knew he'd never be forced to give up. That evening in the dining hall, Edward spoke quietly to Carter and Wallace. "Michael thinks there are files. Proof, Carter's." Lips curved into a knowing smile. "I suspected as much. I've seen staff carrying flash drives back and forth. Always nervous, always quick to hide them." Wallace leaned closer. "If you can get your hands on even one of those, it could blow the whole place wide open. But it's dangerous. They'll medicate you into silence if they suspect anything." Edward felt his pulse quicken. "I can't do this alone." "You won't," Wallace assured him. "We may look beaten down, but we're not finished yet." At night, as the orderlies handed out their little cups of pills, Edward made a show of swallowing while tucking the tablet under his tongue, just as he had before. He kept his movements calm, rehearsed, knowing eyes were watching. Later, after lights out, Michael returned to his room carrying a mop bucket. He whispered through the door, "Tomorrow morning, laundry room, be ready." Then he was gone. Edward lay back in his bed, his heart hammering in his chest. For the first time since stepping foot in Greenfield Manor, he didn't feel completely powerless. He wasn't just a prisoner waiting to be forgotten. He was a man preparing to fight back with allies who still believed in dignity and truth. In freedom, he looked at Margaret's picture on the nightstand and whispered, "They think they've caged me, but they've only given me reason to resist." The next morning, Edward followed Michael's whispered instructions and slipped into the laundry room under the pretense of dropping off sheets. The air was heavy with detergent and steam, the thrum of dryers masking their voices. Glanced around, then pulled a small flash drive from his pocket and pressed it into Edward's hand. "This came from Mrs. Carter," he murmured. "Wallace helped her get it. It's got copies of records, fake diagnoses, medication logs that don't match, even payments from families. Your son's name is on it." Edward felt the weight of it in his palm, as if it were a key to his freedom. He tucked it quickly into the lining of his blazer right beneath the photograph of Margaret he carried everywhere. "Thank you," he whispered. Michael's eyes were serious. "The hard part isn't getting it. It's getting it out. They check everything, bags, pockets, even shoes. You'll only have one chance when your lawyer visits." That night, over dinner, Edward shared the plan with Carter and Wallace. The three of them spoke in low voices, their words drowned out by the clatter of dishes. "They'll never let you hand it over in plain sight," Carter Carter warned. Wallace nodded. They watch every conversation. They can't stop you from hugging him. That may be your only moment. Edward thought about it long into the night. He pictured Thomas arriving, his steady handshake, the calm authority he carried. The idea of slipping the drive into his friend's hand during an embrace felt almost impossible under the gaze of so many watchful eyes. But it was the only path forward. When morning came, Edward was called to the visitation room. His pulse raced as he walked down the long hallway. The room was set up like a staged family gathering. Rows of chairs, a few tables, a nurse positioned by the door, clipboard in hand, and there he was. Thomas Reed, silver hair, pressed suit, the kind of presence that made even the staff straighten. Their posture. His eyes lit when he saw Edward, though his expression quickly sobered at the sight of the guards hovering nearby. Thomas greeted warmly, stepping forward. "How are they treating you?" Edward smiled faintly, though his hands trembled. About as well as a bird in a cage. They sat, talking casually, careful with their words. Edward could feel the nurse's eyes on them, recording every gesture, every pause. The moment felt like an elaborate play, where one wrong line could expose the truth. Thomas leaned in slightly. "Do you have it?" Edward's breath caught. "Yes, but they're watching." Thomas nodded slowly, his eyes shifting to the nurse. Then back to Edward. "When we part, hug me, that's when." The visit stretched on, filled with small talk about books, the weather, even old college memories. To anyone listening, it sounded ordinary, almost dull. But beneath the surface, every word carried tension. Edward's fingers brushed the lining of his jacket again and again, checking for the small flash drive hidden beneath Margaret's photo. Finally, the nurse announced, "Time's up." Edward stood, his knees unsteady. Thomas rose too, extending his arms. "Take care, my friend." The embrace was brief, but in that instant, Edward pressed the flash drive into Thomas's palm. Their eyes met, and Thomas gave the slightest nod, slipping it into his pocket as though it were nothing more than a handkerchief. "Stay strong," Thomas whispered. Edward pulled back, his throat tight with emotion. He felt both terrified and relieved, like a man who had just jumped from a burning building and trusted someone would catch him below, as the guards led him back to his room. Edward's heart pounded with a fragile hope. For the first time, the scales had tipped not in Daniel's favor, not in Jessica's, not in the institution's, but toward truth. That night, lying in bed with Margaret's photograph by his side, Edward whispered into the dark, "We're one step closer, love. They won't silence me, not this time." The day after Thomas slipped the flash drive into his pocket, Edward sat in his narrow bed at Greenfield Manor, staring at the rain streaking down the window. He didn't know exactly what was on that drive, but he trusted Carter, Wallace, and Michael. If it held even a fraction of what they believed, it could be enough to tear the mask off the whole rotten operation that afternoon. Thomas strode into the courthouse with the flash drive in hand. He had already prepared a motion for emergency review, but what he carried now was more than argument, it was proof. Inside the tiny piece of plastic was a record of forged evaluations, altered medication logs, and direct payments from families. To the director, one of the payments bore Daniel's name. The judge assigned to the case was known for his sternness and refusal to tolerate games. As Thomas laid out the evidence, the judge's face grew harder by the minute. When the USB was inserted and the documents filled the courtroom screen, a hush fell over everyone. There it was in black and white, Edward Thompson's diagnosis stamped before he had even been evaluated. His son listed as financial guarantor, and a schedule of care costs that conveniently matched the outstanding debts on Daniel. In Jessica's accounts, by the end of the session, the judge signed an order. Edward Thompson was to be released immediately. Greenfield Manor would be investigated for fraud and abuse, and Daniel Monteverde, once the proud son in a tailored suit, was to be taken into custody for elder exploitation and assault. Back at Greenfield, Edward was summoned to the administrator's office. When he stepped in, 2 officers were already waiting. The director, who had once spoken to him with smug authority, now sat pale and sweating. "Mr. Thompson," one of the officers said, "you're free to go." "Free?" The word washed over him like sunlight after weeks of shadow. As he packed his few belongings, just a bag of clothes and Margaret's photo, Carter and Wallace met his eyes across the hall. Carter gave him the smallest of nods, her lips curving into a brave smile. Wallace whispered, "Don't forget us." Edward's heart clenched. "I won't. Not ever." Thomas was waiting for him outside the gates, and Edward stepped into the crisp autumn air. His old friend clasped his hand firmly. "It's over, Ed. You're going home." But the real homecoming was still ahead. That evening, when Edward walked back into his little bookstore, the smell of old pages and cedar shelves wrapped around him like an embrace. And standing by the counter was Emily. The moment she saw him, she dropped her backpack and ran into his arms. "Grandpa," she sobbed, clutching him as if she'd never let go. "I was so scared, I thought I'd lost you." He held her close, his voice thick with emotion. "No, sweetheart. You saved me. If it weren't for your courage, I might still be trapped in there." In the days that followed, the news broke wide. Local papers carried headlines about the scandal at Greenfield Manor, the fraudulent schemes, the dozens of seniors who had been silenced with heavy medication. Families began demanding answers. Lawsuits piled up. The facility's gates, once polished and proud, were now draped with police tape. Daniel, meanwhile, faced charges of elder abuse, fraud, and assault. Edward, despite all he had endured, asked the court for leniency for Emily's sake. He couldn't bear the thought of her growing up with the shame of seeing her father imprisoned for decades. The judge agreed to a reduced sentence, though it was still long enough to strip Daniel of the life he thought he had built. Jessica vanished from the headlines soon after, her carefully crafted social image crumbling overnight. For Edward, there was no satisfaction in their downfall. Only the quiet relief of knowing they could no longer hurt him or use him. Months later, the bookstore thrived again. Customers returned, drawn not just by the shelves of well-loved classics, but by the quiet presence of Edward himself, always ready with a recommendation and a kind word. And more often than not, Emily was there too, helping stock the shelves. Reading aloud passages of her favorite novels. One evening, as the two of them closed up shop, she turned to him and said, "Grandma would be proud, wouldn't she?" Edward looked at her, his eyes softening. "She'd be proud of you. You were the one who stood up when no one else did." "Oh, yes." They stepped out into the evening together, the lights of the bookstore glowing warmly behind them. For Edward, the scars of betrayal were still there. But so was something stronger, the reminder that family isn't measured by blood or by signatures on a deed. It's measured by loyalty, by love, by the courage to stand by one another when everything else falls apart. And as he walked beside his granddaughter, Edward knew that no matter how much had been taken from him, he still had the one thing Daniel and Jessica could never steal, the bond of a heart that loved him without condition.